first thing I want to talk about is this announcement that we had at a State Department press conference last week. The State Department spokesperson is Ned Price. We've talked about him a lot in the things he says on the show in the past. And he said that the U.S. was declassifying intelligence that showed that Russia was going to make or may make a fabricated video of the aftermath of an explosion, including equipment appearing to belong to Ukraine or allied nations. And this would involve crisis actors and, would allege, I think, to show dead Russians to really drive the war effort in Russia. Now, I think there's a lot wrong with this, and then we'll talk about the aftermath, which is getting a lot of attention, and that's the cross-examination here by AP reporter Matt Lee. But just to get into this initial claim, now it seems really absurd that Russia would, make a fake video like this in 2022. Maybe 30 years ago that this is even like 10, 15 years ago, this is probably something that you could have pulled off. But to do it in 2022, where there's social media everywhere, how are you going to fake an explosion and then not have anyone actually realize it? Or, if you say this explosion went off in this village, well, everybody in that village is going to turn their cameras on their phone that they all have outside and stream whatever's going on to whatever social media account they prefer, and all that will be up there. And so I don't know if you could really stage it. Now, it would be another thing to claim, and they have in the past, that Russia was just going to carry out a false flag attack, and that seems to be far more likely to me if you're just talking about like what would actually work. This just seems really dumb that to even allege that Russia would do this, because again, I don't think it would work. And even when you have places like Syria, where there was like more limited internet connection, everything like that, and we're talking about 10 years ago too, a lot of these crisis actor videos did get discovered. And again, I don't think it works as well. Like with a Syrian war, if you're trying to convince Western media, then yeah, you can have a bunch of Egyptians find some destroyed buildings out in the Sinai and have some kids lay down in some concrete and throw some dust over them, and people in the Western media will buy it. I really suspect that would not work anywhere in Ukraine, and that this is just kind of a dumb thing that the U.S. is alleging. Now, another problem, I guess, that I have with it is I think it kind of misrepresents what the Russians and Putin want out of this. And also, I don't know if Putin would necessarily want to drive war propaganda. I think that would see him as like tying his hands and things like that. If you really do drive it to the point where your population is demanding war, then that politically could, in a way limit your options. I don't really think that, people necessarily want war, but at the same time, if you really get them into a fervor that war must be had, then, that could, in a way, either limit up what a politician could do, or they would face like negative repercussions from it, and there would be more arguments in the public against it, right? If they fake this video, but then everybody in Russia thinks it's real, and Putin gets a deal that he wants from the West, they could all still be crying for blood, and it could limit his options there. So I don't think that Russia would necessarily take this route. But then after the State Department made this announcement, we had one reporter in the room ask real questions, and that was the AP reporter Matt Lee, who we have talked about in this show quite a bit in the past, just because he is one of the few reporters that will really question the narrative that the White House is putting forward and what the State Department is saying. Not that you could always rely on Matt Lee and everything like that, but of the selection that you have in the press corps, he is very good and does ask actual questions. And so, what actually gets said here is a very long back and forth where they talk over each other. If you want to watch the video, the Hill tweeted out one version that really covers it. I think gives a pretty good example of what happens. Is several minutes long, and again, there's some crosstalk over each other and everything, but basically Matt Lee is pushing Ned Price, the spokesperson, to unveil in some ways, some way, why the U.S. thinks that Russia is going to do this. And he's saying, what's the intelligence? And Kirby is saying, well, the intelligence is what I just told you. We said we think it's going to happen. And, he's trying to get to why. And at one point, Kirby even says, like, look, I could... Price says that, look, I could print this out for you, but you're gonna get what you're gonna get. That's just the situation here, and we're only giving you this, and we expect, I think, the media to go ahead and reprint it as it's fact. And Price brings up, or not Price, excuse me, Lee brings up the fact that in the past, the U.S. has lied about these kind of things and gotten them wrong before, and so it's really problematic. I have this article up on the screen right now for anybody watching, by Jeff Schogel at Task and Purpose. He's a pretty good writer over there. He likes to take an edgy approach and everything like that. And so this article is fantastic, but he brings up how problematic it is that the White House, press team, apparently, we have this from Jen Psaki, as we talked about in the last episode of the show, last week's bonus show with Matteo Macchioni, where we broke down the raid against the ISIS leader. And in there, the U.S. was making a statement on Air Force One. Jen Psaki was taking questions from the press, and one of the press asked, well, how do we know what the narrative you're putting out is more or less correct? And Psaki suggested then that, you were looking to amplify or believe the ISIS narrative because you weren't immediately willing to accept the U.S. narrative. And look, we could spend 2 episodes of the show of me just ranting about all the times that the U.S. makes up these war narratives to get the American people to go along. Babies in incubators, Viagra to soldiers, chemical weapons in Syria, the Houthis are backed by Iran. But so many of the times they just turn out flatly not to be true at all. Bounties, Taliban Russian bounty connection. And so it's great that some reporters are asking questions, but the response from the White House is terrifying, to suggest that any questioning of the official narrative put out by the White House is equivalent to supporting or promoting the narrative of what is deemed as the enemy of the American people. All right, now moving on to a press conference by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and he's a pretty important member in the White House. I think he has a lot to say when it comes to foreign policy. And last week on the show, we had talked about that the White House was actually backing away from using the word imminent to describe the possible Russian invasion of Ukraine, saying that, or I guess at the behest of the Ukrainians, who have been arguing that the U.S. was very much overstating the risk of potential invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and saying that they were creating a crisis and a panic. And these statements were even made by the Ukrainian president. So now at this press conference, we seem to have Sullivan cutting against that, not using the word imminent, but saying that Russia could invade Ukraine at, quote, any day, launching a conflict that would come at enormous human cost. So very interesting on the rhetoric, and that's the part of the Sullivan presser that's making the headlines. But I think there's an even more important statement that he made. And this is something that I've been talking about on the show for, almost a year now, but definitely throughout this latest military buildup quite a bit since November, that the officials in the U.S. who are making these decisions are not the brightest bunch, and they could really make a decision that costs the lives of a lot of people, either by miscalculation or by calculating that the lives of the Ukrainians really don't matter, and we're willing to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian to bloody Putin's nose. And I have a little bit more confirmation that there are at least people in the administration that really believe this with this statement from Jake Sullivan. He says, if war breaks out, it will come at an enormous human cost to Ukraine, but we believe that based on our preparations and our response, it will come at a strategic cost to Russia as well. And I really think that what he's talking about there is everything that the military, the White House, and the CIA have been doing for the past, really 4 or 5 years now, to train the Ukrainians to fight an insurgency, to give them various weapons that will be maybe somewhat effective against the Russian military, and, not preventing Russia from invasion, not stopping a Russian invasion, but, costing the Russians a few thousand troops and, billions of dollars, and making this a real lasting insurgency for the Russians. Not that, it would necessarily play out this way. I'm not saying that, because of everything the U.S. has done, that, they could really bloody Putin's nose and that there's going to be a lasting insurgency in Ukraine. However, I think it's very possible that there are members of the Biden administration that do think that they could essentially give Putin an Afghanistan in Ukraine. And it's really concerning to me seeing this statement from Jake Sullivan. And again, maybe it's a little bit of confirmation bias on my part, because this is something that I've been concerned and worrying about throughout the Biden administration. But this does seem to indicate there are at least people within the administration that believe this. Next up, this story from the Washington Post that has gained a lot of attention in the Western press is titled, "Russia Seize Kiev in Days and Caused 50,000 Civilian Casualties in Ukraine. U.S. Assessment Finds." This Washington Post report is based on 7 sources, I guess, that are familiar with U.S. military and intelligence reports, or assessments, excuse me. It's not exactly, I guess, clear to me if all these 7 people are saying the same things and confirming everything, or they have like 2 people confirming this, that, and the other thing. So this could be a little bit more thinly sourced than it sounds, but I don't necessarily doubt that the Biden administration is calculating these sort of things would happen. And so they say that the war could cause 50,000 civilian casualties. Those are killed and wounded. 5 to 25,000 Ukrainian soldiers being killed or wounded, causing 5 million refugees, and that Ukraine or Kiev could be taken within days of the conflict starting. I guess all this sounds fairly correct. Maybe the casualty numbers sound a little low, if anything, particularly for the Ukrainian military. Although I guess if you're the U.S. and calculating that you really want to give Russia a bloody nose, saying that you calculate like 50% or something of the Ukrainian military is going to be wiped out in a Russian invasion, well then, it might hurt the morale of the Ukrainian government. Also, I'm not sure how much the U.S. factors this in, but something to consider: when Russia took the Crimean Peninsula, a good, I think maybe majority of the military actually defected and just joined up the Russian side of this whole thing. And that's part of the reason why there was no fighting in death for the Crimean Peninsula. And so if Russia were to decide to invade, I guess it's possible that for a couple of reasons, either that a significant portion of the military could just join Ukraine. Sorry, I lost my thoughts there. They also point out in this article that Russia is continuing with its military buildup. I'm not saying that this is true or the case. I'm just saying that this is what the Washington Post is reporting is the assessment of the U.S. government. And there are now 83 Russian battalion tactical groups with 750 troops each, arrayed for an impossible assault. They say this is up from 62 weeks ago, and it comprises 70% of what Russia President Vladimir Putin needs to have in place if he wants to maximize the operation. I'm assuming that this last sentence is actually important and something I've been trying to figure out, because they've been putting the number at 175,000 Russian troops are needed to invade Ukraine, when what does that mean, right? There's a huge difference between annexing the Donbass region of Ukraine, which I do think the West would count as invasion, and especially in the kind of PR sphere that we're in right now, I think the Biden administration would phrase that as an invasion of Ukraine if Russia were to annex the Crimean Peninsula or take, any more of eastern Ukraine there. But at the same time, if Russia were to do that or take some of eastern Ukraine, that would obviously require a lot less military force than taking the entire Ukrainian state, right? And this saying that that's the maximum option, the 175, I guess, needed, and now it's 70%. That does, I guess, make me understand where Jake Sullivan is getting his ability to say, we assess that it could come at any day. He's probably assessing that, if Russia is just going to take the Donbass, that could happen at any time. Again, I'm just trying to parse through and figure out where all this rhetoric is coming from on the Biden administration side. There's still discrepancy in the number of actual Russian troops that are in the area. U.S. officials have continued to say that it's 100,000, and they continue to say along the border, which apparently means, I guess, within 200 or 300 miles of the Ukrainian border. And so I think there's a lot of wiggle room and flexibility on all these numbers still. They talk about 30,000 troops have recently entered the arena, Russian troops arriving in Belarus, and also that Russia had carried out, and I believe this was announced by Russia and everything, 2 nuclear capable bombers, I believe it was 2, flying over Belarus. And this is something that I think matches what the U.S. will occasionally do, fly nuclear capable bombers over the Baltic states or something like that, right up onto Russia's border. We have also in this article laying out again, this is the U.S. assessment. I'm not saying, as Kyle Anzalone, I think this is the case, but I'm saying that this is what the reporting is, that the U.S. assesses that the invasion is going to come when the ground is all frozen in Ukraine, which they've been saying, but they're now giving the window on that between mid-February and through the end of March, that the ground is going to be frozen. And they're saying that it will likely not come until after the Olympics, although I really don't think that's as big of a deal as the U.S. officials are actually suggesting. So the next thing in this article that I think is pretty important is that, and we'll take a second here and detour to the meeting between Putin and Xi, where in this meeting, Putin traveled to China as the opening ceremonies are going on in the Olympics, and they exchange very public and friendly messages and everything like that. I do think there is probably a real friendship between Putin and Xi, and that is something important and something to remember. But they then released a statement that said these parties oppose the further expansion of NATO and call on the Northern Atlantic Alliance to abandon the ideological approaches of the Cold War. And I think this was a fairly important statement, and the statement also addressed Taiwan, declaring the democratically ruled and denouncing calls for independence. So so they said that Taiwan is a part of China and denounced calls for independence. I think that it was probably this article from The Hill that actually inserted the democratically ruled island part of that, and that's more Western propaganda and not something that's actually believed by the leaders of China and Russia. So want to go through and just mention here that, getting back to this Washington Post article, that American leaders aren't very concerned about the joint statement between Putin and Xi, and they said that they would be more concerned about it if it actually mentioned China, or actually mentioned Ukraine, but it didn't, and for that reason, they're fairly non-concerned about this, and that seems like a real miscalculation on my part. Although it does add to some of the points that Ray McGovern has been making in his articles, that the Americans, and particularly the Biden administration, have really failed to understand the significance of the Russia-China relationship and what that is turning into, and that, you know, kind of the Cold War playbook of you could balance Russia off China and you really don't have to worry about those two coming together. It should be thrown out the window, and we really need to assess what the new Russian Putin-led government is willing to do with the new Chinese Communist Party led by Xi Jinping. So let's see. I think that's pretty much it for this article, except at the very end, it does mention that there is a plan in the Pentagon to quickly move out the 300 or so U.S. Florida National Guard members should a Russian invasion happen. And so I guess, good thing they're not just going to put them on the front lines to stay and fight. But at the same time, shouldn't we have them leave now if we're that concerned about a Russian invasion happening? Why are they continuing to remain in Ukraine in harm's way if the Pentagon, which deployed them, is so concerned about a Russian invasion of Ukraine? So a little bit more on the Putin-Xi meeting. I wanted to mention that Xi has not met with another foreign leader since the COVID outbreak happened, and I believe this, was a part of trying to represent China's no COVID policy and everything like that. I disagree, and we talked a lot, especially in the early days of COVID, when people were talking about bringing the China model to the U.S. About rejecting what the Chinese COVID lockdown strategy is, and I still oppose it. But at the same time, it is worth, I think, mentioning here that the Chinese leader has kind of represented what he was trying to do with his people and hasn't been traveling around the world as much as, say, the Biden administration has, where they've really been doing a lot of traveling and everything like that. And so that's another reason that this visit between Putin and Xi is very significant and is really being missed by the Western media on that. Now, let's see, what else do I have on this? Oh, could mention here too, just while we're talking about China's COVID lockdown policy, China's upset with the U.S. for starting to withdraw some embassy staff and their families because they're dissatisfied with the COVID lockdown policies of China. They do seem fairly extreme measures, and look, if you don't want to live in that, you don't want to live in that. And from China's perspective, them saying that everybody has to live with the Chinese COVID policies, that doesn't seem correct to me. And so this is one place, where the U.S. withdrawing their embassy staff actually seems kind of reasonable, assuming the COVID restrictions are actually, oppressive and interfering with life in a significant way, which they, do seem to be in China. So now on to some very important news. French President Emmanuel Macron will travel to Russia tomorrow. That's Monday the 7th, to meet with Vladimir Putin. And this, is important for a lot of reasons. If the U.S. was saying, as the U.S. was saying, a Russian invasion of Ukraine could happen any day, I kind of doubt that Macron would be going to Moscow to meet with Putin. We also have Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany. He's scheduled to go to Russia next week. I believe the 15th. He's going to be making a stop first in Ukraine and then going on to Russia. So these planned visits, I think, really should lower the temperature of the concern of a Russian invasion, particularly, as the U.S. attempts to dial them up as much as possible. And so Macron has made some very important statements in this interview with JDD, and he says, the intensity of dialogue we have had with Russia and the visit to Moscow are likely to prevent a military operation from happening. Then we will discuss the terms of de-escalation. I have always been in a deep dialogue with President Putin, and our responsibility is to build historic solutions. And then he goes on to say, the geopolitical objective of Russia today is clearly not Ukraine, but to clarify the rules of cohabitation with NATO and the EU. And unlike anything that we've heard from the Biden administration, this seems to be a fairly clear-eyed statement on what's actually going on here. And I think very important. If the French president is saying this, he's going to Russia saying, look, Russia doesn't want to invade Ukraine. They want to come to some kind of lasting security situation in Eastern Europe as NATO has, well, he doesn't say this, but as NATO has advanced towards Russia's borders and created a insecure situation for Russia in Eastern Europe. So let's see, anything else? I don't think I want to mention anything else on that other than I think it's very important, and I think we should feel a little bit less confident that there's going to be a Russia invasion of Ukraine than the Americans, certainly than the Americans are putting forward. But, even I think more some mainstream people are putting forward, it seems less and less likely to be happening to me. Although at the same time, the U.S. is really ignoring some pretty legitimate security concerns of Russia, and, nothing's off the table. Now, want to just mention this last article here. While German President Olaf Scholz is planning to travel to Russia, and that seems to be a pretty good thing when you're talking about Russian German ties, we do have this kind of tit for tat thing happening on the media end, where Germany ordered RT to cease broadcasting its German language programs within Germany, and then in response, the Russians had DW, the German media outlet, close its Moscow office. My guess is closing the office will not have any significant impact on Russian and German relations. However, it is a step in the wrong direction, as things definitely need to be moving in the right direction. All right.